So today we wanted to focus on decompartmentalization overall that
Nailed
seems to
it.
be occurring and the foundations of freedom.
Fascinating.
Yes, sir.
You got a lot to say on that.
Absolutely. So, Vigilant News, Justin, Ryan, we had the pleasure, I had the pleasure of meeting you guys, but Simon, you guys have been working together for a long time, or known each other for a long time. You've given me a bit of your backstory, but can you guys kind of run through that and give the audience, let's say, a bit of your backstory? Because what you guys are doing is awesome. You guys are with Badlands Media right now. You have your own show. You guys are well put together. Can you give us a little bit of backstory?
Yeah, sure. So I got into researching, trying to figure out the truth many years ago, I guess. Well, it feels like it anyway. Back in 2010, discovered there were cures for cancer. They were being suppressed. Tried to disprove it. Did the opposite. I went to school for physics, so I have pretty good science mind. I can kind of tell shenanigans versus not. And then that really opened my mind up. In 2013, I started an outfit called Stillness in the Storm. It was just like me posting all sorts of stuff, news, research. In 2019, I believe, I met you, and I needed help because we were expanding, and Ryan came on to help me with all sorts of stuff. One of the things was managing sets, or Stillness in the Storm. And then in 2022, I believe, we started Vigilant News, and we got picked up by Badlands a few months later. So that's the quick rundown on me. What do you got to say?
Well, I just want to say it's an honor to be on the show with you guys. You're two of my favorite boys. You're good boys. Happy to be here.
Glad to have you, sir.
Thank you. So my background is in journalism. That's what I went to school for. I started practicing journalism while I was living in Hollywood in an election year. And, I started out...
What year was that?
2016. So I was
the election year.
Yeah, the year that changed everything in my life, pretty much. I was writing kind of tabloidy stuff like, 10 celebrities who are now ugly, or why did this politician eat a burrito out of a diaper, and stuff like that. My personal favorite was the 50 best Simpson tattoos of all time.
That's not bad. That's a good one.
But it was mostly soul crushing, and at that time, there's nowhere you could go in that city where you couldn't see or hear Hillary Clinton's like contrived cackle on a TV screen. It was just blasted from all angles, and it was nauseating because I was fortunate enough to read a book called Rule by Secrecy when I was 17 by Jim Mars. So I was kind of hip to the whole, it's like two sides of the same coin. There's a uniparty, all that stuff, but I was like really disinterested in politics. But that year, for whatever reason, it just kind of turned around, and I was so sick of doing the tabloidy stuff. And I was having a lot of fun watching the debates where Donald Trump was just creaming Jeb Bush, that I was like, maybe I could get into this. So I started that way. I was totally like nonpartisan. But then as time went on, things started happening in the world where it seemed like there was actually an anti-establishment faction in the Republican Party that was forming around Donald Trump. And so I started to definitely veer in that direction. And then obviously, there's a lot of lore and mythos surrounding what was going on with the Trump administration, and I got into all that. That's how I met Justin. I reached out to him. He brought me on as a managing editor for Stillness in the Storm, and the rest is history.
The rest is good history.
Yeah.
And so interesting. Simon knows this, and maybe I told you guys this when we met. We met in Tulsa, Oklahoma, at Clay Clark's event. We just spoke to Clay Clark recently. He is a firebrand if there ever was one.
Yeah.
He can a mile a minute. But so my introduction to this whole world. So I was a Bernie bro in 2016.
Nice.
I live in Canada. Me and Simon live in Canada. I was like, oh, Bernie's the answer. And then I see Hillary Clinton essentially steal the primary, which was just blatant. It was just obvious.
Yeah.
And he was too much of a uncontrollable figure, I think, in the Democratic Party. But so that's what kind of got me. I'm like, okay, they're just going to blatantly steal us. And it's obvious that Hillary Clinton is a criminal, and the whole Clinton Foundation and blah blah blah. And then Jordan Peterson got me thinking. Jordan Peterson just kind of rerouted my brain in the way to think about things. So we all have our different entrances, and then the real thing that got me on screen, let's say, and actually, because I'm a lot more new to this than some of you guys, well, than Simon and Justin and Ryan, I think we're about the same time. but was COVID, obviously. When you see this stuff, and it's just like the need to deconstruct this and spread information because there's so much nonsense out there. I actually wanted to talk to you. You mentioned cancer research. Is that one that you went into significantly? Do you have a lot of background in that? Can you kind of walk me through kind of why that was a catalyst for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, like I was saying, I went to school for physics. I've kind of always been very science-minded. I'm also into psychology and philosophy and law, so those are like the kind of my three pillars. And because of that, I study something called epistemology, which basically is the quote unquote science of knowledge, I like to say it. So it's like, how do you actually know something's true? How do you know a scientific paper was done well? How do you know if a news story is true? These kind of things. And on that, there's not like a magic button you can press to know if something's absolutely true or false or not. That you're just like an investigator. You got to gather evidence. You got to assess it. You got to analyze it. You got to create a suspect list, so to speak, to figure out which claim seems the most right. And you're always keeping your mind open. So I encountered this film called The Gerson Miracle on Netflix. Believe it or not, it's not on there anymore. And it was talking about this guy who cured cancer in 1928. And he did a process of juicing and fasting and detoxification, specifically coffee enemas, because
that's my favorite part.
Yeah, exactly. That's the bull tail right there. So
I don't even have cancer. I just want to.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Well, we got a whole fan group of that. No, I'm just kidding. So anyway, so the punchline is this guy presented his information to Congress in 1946 during a series of congressional panels that were specifically designed, at least on the surface, to establish an effective cancer policy. And despite the fact that, in not so many words, the Congress acknowledged the fact that he had found a method of curing cancer, not just treating cancer, but curing it, getting rid of it entirely. They did not want to go with his body of research because they wanted to go with radiation, surgery, and chemo as their main methods. And again, they didn't say this outright, but it's because they can make more money off of that. And there are other benefits for them for having those methods and not acknowledging Gerson's work. So Gerson was died of suspicious circumstances in 1955, I believe. And real quick, 30 seconds on his process. So he discovered he was treating tuberculosis, did this juicing and fasting protocol, got people off of their highly processed nitrated meats. And not only did their tuberculosis go away, but their skin cancer went away, their liver cancer went away, their throat cancer went away, all these different things went away. And so he's like, whoa, what the heck's going on here? Well, he also needed to use coffee enemas because detoxification was huge. There's something that I call the rain barrel effect, not my term. Somebody else has a book about that, really great book, by the way. And the rain barrel effect basically means that your body will absorb toxins and store them in all sorts of places for years until it can't anymore, until your rain barrel fills up. And that's when you start to see all these issues pop up, which span the gambit. So when he started to do this juicing, the juicing and the fasting would actually unlock these toxins from all these stored places. And if they didn't use the coffee enemas, then they would basically kill the person because there was so much toxins in their body. And the coffee enemas are designed to strip or remove the toxins out of their body using the process of the body's natural mechanism, which is, I forget the technical term, but basically your body's liver produces bile. That bile has the ability to siphon away toxins using an electrolytic process in the small intestines through the small intestine barrier there, the permeable barrier. And so when you do the coffee enemas, it works. It filters your blood with like 5 times within 15 minutes. It's equivalent to 24 hours of kidney dialysis. So it's very effective. There's a whole culture built around these things now. And so anyway, like I said, I studied that. I'm like, I'm going to debunk this garbage because clearly there are no cures for cancer, or I would have heard about them online. I would have seen them on the news. We wouldn't have a billion-dollar cancer research industry, the typical things most people who don't know anything talk about when it comes to this subject. And I could not disprove it. As a matter of fact, I proved it was likely true. And once I started to acknowledge that possibility, my whole world unraveled. Like I just could not wrap my head around why this was not being spread far and wide. And just one set of dominoes over the next, quote unquote, red pill experience. And I discovered that basically everything I thought was true needed to be carefully examined and evaluated. and I needed to somehow create my own belief system from scratch. And so that's what I began to do.
So that's the epistemological approach, would you say, where you break things down to the things that you know for sure. So I've been reading a bit or looking into Descartes and his meditations, and he has, I think, 6 meditations that are just kind of chapters of a long kind of discourse that he's having. And the idea is that he breaks things down into things he knows for sure, things that are probably true, and then I think things that are just like hearsay, or I would add that section, things that like we've just heard in passing and we pass for truth. And then when you ask the question, we lost Simon. I'm sure he'll be back. When you start asking the question, okay, well, like, so it's like, how do you know that somebody says something like, I don't know, viruses cause cancer, or viruses cause HIV. It's like, well, how do you know that? It's like, oh, well, I've heard it my whole life, so I think it's true. I've heard from people that I respect as authorities in that field. And then when you start to break it down more and you actually start to think for yourself, a lot of things are just, fluff that was passed on. And it's interesting, the date that you said, 1955, I think, that he died,
something like that. Yeah.
So in around that time, that's when cancer research really took off, and billions of dollars went to these doctors. Oh, Simon, you're back.
I just got kicked off. Maybe my internet died. I don't know.
Okay, well, we got you. We weren't talking shit about you. Don't worry.
So paranoid and insecure.
I missed you.
But so yeah, I mean, that cancer research took off, and then when they figured out that, for the longest time they were talking about a cure for cancer, there was a war on cancer, and they never made any headway in that. Once that started to fade, guess where all the research went? It all went to HIV and AIDS and Dr. Fauci and the NIH. So all of those cancer labs where they weren't able to prove that cancer was caused by a virus, they thought cancer was caused by a virus actually for a long time. So it's interesting. You're right. Once you take one thing apart and realize that it's a complete lie, and then you also look at what the implications are of people that are funding it and people that are making money from it, it's just you can connect the dots in so many ways, and it's all nonsense. And there's more and more now a new paradigm that's forming in cancer medicine, where they see it as a metabolic disease and not actually a genetic mutation disease, where it's your cells and the crystalline water in your cells, which is a whole nother story. There's the fourth phase of water, which is a book by Gerald Pollack. But so the idea is that in your cells, water is in a certain state. It's not in a liquid state. It's not in a solid state. It's not in a gaseous state. It's in a kind of what he calls the fourth phase of water, which is kind of like a gelatin crystallized structure, right? If you get cut, you don't start leaking water, right? Your cells, that crystalline structure stays intact. But so now the idea is that you don't have enough, your metabolism isn't strong enough, and you don't have enough energy being taken from your nutrition, from your food, to keep those cells actually in healthy working form. So they start to close in on themselves. And then at that point, they no longer have their own metabolism. And the only thing they can do is divide. I think it's mitosis. So the idea is that cell is a dying cell, and the only thing it knows how to do, the only thing left for it to do is to divide. And that's how you start to get metastases. Right. Okay, so the cancer part is super interesting. Simon, would you like to chime in a little bit on the cancer thing, or?
Well, yeah, because I was thinking that, we're looking at the foundations of truth, right? And this struggle to bring the human collective towards more truthfulness is this larger challenge that we're facing, right? And empowering people to seek the truth is kind of messy business, because there's too many truths to seek right now, right? It's such an insane influx of disclosures and revelations that it's no longer about whether or not you're going to get the truth, because it's coming at you kind of no matter what these days. But it's like navigating what truths are correct for you specifically, but also the process of getting there. And there was something that, you went through, Justin, in your experience with cancer, which is really this process of steel manning, the argument of really, really actually trying to disprove, what is before you. And I think this is a bit of a lost tool. I think the impact of social media, echo chambers, and the algorithms that really reinforce our bias and reinforce the feeling that we should just keep chasing our bias instead of trying to disprove what is before us. I mean, I think that's a big step in getting people towards collective truth and individual truth.
Well, that's one of the things that actually I'm glad you brought up Descartes and the meditations, because one of the things that sets our show apart from most of the shows on Badlands is that we don't really have a this is what's happening kind of mentality. It's like we take world events and we try to look at them from every angle and determine what's more likely, what are the possibilities, without getting too attached to an outcome. Because I'm sure it's happened to you before where you were so certain of something and then that didn't happen, and it's like a huge blowback. And so
Yeah,
what we try
there's too much certainty in the world.
yeah, exactly. And most of the things people are certain about are just wrong. So it's
Right,
like,
exactly.
especially post like awakening or being red pilled. It's like you
Right,
think now if
absolutely.
it's something that deviates from the main narrative, it must be true.
People need to be empowered with this capacity to really question what's going on. And I was recently speaking to Boone Cutler, interviewing him for one of my upcoming film projects. And he was talking about this process of being able to navigate the information war and really getting specific terms nailed down for it. So, for example, when someone sees something and is emotionally hooked into it and just shares it because it reinforces their own bias, this is what they call information operation fratricide. Right. It's the idea that we are committing fratricide on, our brothers at war, who are fighting with us by sharing bad information.
Exactly.
And our enemy is trying to get us to commit information operation fratricide. And, they also talk about Boone and Flynn in their books on fifth generation warfare, also talk about the 72-hour rule. When something arrives, that's like a big charged up news story or headline, just a big narrative kicks into the world. You really should be waiting 72 hours before you commit any kind of certainty to what is really going on with that. So I just, I think about you, Justin, going through that process of being like, I'm going to debunk this, and that really being the means by which you got to the truth. And I think there's something to be said about trying to get people back into that place against the very intense pressure for them to seek out their bias, because that's really what they're being engineered to do.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it takes humility, I think. So
Right. So the humility and the certainty, those are that duality is one of the biggest problems in the world. Actually, there's too many people that are absolutely certain of their position, and they don't have the humility to be able to understand that they could be wrong about everything. Right. I don't trust, and I don't let's say admire people who don't have the humility to understand that they can be wrong about everything. Right. Like you said, Ryan, there's so many things that I've thought were true. I was a Bernie bro. I thought he was going to save America. That turns out to be completely wrong once I thought about it a little more. Can you continue on your train of thought of how you guys how you deconstruct things, and you don't start with the ending, let's say the conclusion, and then work backwards. You break it down, and you're not married to the ending. And can you incorporate kind of the ethos of your show, of Vigilant News, and what Vigilant News does, and what your goal is as an organization, let's say?
Totally. So at Badlands, there's a lot of shows that are catered to a certain narrative, and they all have different ones too. So it's not like everyone's in total agreement. What sets us apart is that we try to look at every event that happens in the world through multiple lenses, because, no one's always right all the time. And when you, like what Simon was saying with the 72-hour rule, most people don't adhere to that. They jump to conclusions. And I personally believe that people seed out narratives that they want people to be invested in before they really think rationally about it. Because once you're invested in something, it's harder to kind of pull back from it. Yep. And I see that happening all the time in the community. So it's like there's this pendulum effect where you were sleepwalking, watching the mainstream media, and then something happens where you start to wake up and you go to the extreme opposite end, where now anything that deviates from the mainstream narrative is true suddenly. And then comes the process of kind of like coming back down to earth And we try to help people get to that point, because really the whole problem with the mainstream media to begin with is that we just trust them implicitly to tell us what's what. And people are so used to that. And they think now, well, without even realizing what they're doing the same thing to people in the alternative decentralized media space.
Yep.
Like I like these people. What they're saying sounds good to me, so that's what I think is happening. And we try to like bring more of a what Justin calls multivariant thinking approach to current events and stuff like that. So, for example, with this recent FISA bill, there's a lot of people in the community who believe, oh, it's part of some plan. You know, they need to keep it around because it goes both ways, and quote unquote white hats can use it against the bad guys. And it's like, that might be true, but also it might not be true. And now you're supporting the government spying on you and like totally exceeding what it should be allowed to do. So it's like, we try to like bring both sides of an equation into perspective for people. What do you have anything to say about it?
No, I echo all of that. And that's something that, you know, we're not doing it for popularity, because if we want it to be popular, we just pick the narrative that's the most popular and reinforce it.
Oh yeah, we've slaughtered some
and be
cows.
first to the scene. Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Sacred cows on our side.
Yeah.
On quote unquote our side.
And not even like to tell people like this is for sure what's happening. It's just like, you might be wrong about this thing that we all tend to believe.
Right, exactly. Right. So, but I mean, if ultimately there's a kind of learning that happens, you know, I refer to it as intrinsic knowledge. So when you've carefully thought about an issue, you've weighed the evidence, you can actually move from one perspective to the next and see why one might be true versus untrue. All these things, you hold all that in your head, which I call multidimensional thinking. Then it doesn't really matter what information comes out. You can catch it, you can play with it, you can incorporate it, and you can be dynamic with it, so that you can use knowledge for kind of what I think God gave us it for, which is to anticipate events, to work with other people. And so the more intrinsic knowledge you have, the more skill you can develop, the more you can safeguard yourself, your family, your community against liars, con men, you know, government operations, you name it. So.
Yeah, a big problem is we wind up in an echo chamber on either side. I think ours is a little less egregious or less intense as the other side, because the other side is just absurd. I don't even know what the other side is, really. Like, they don't even know, right? That's why you have people like Joe Rogan, who by all measures is a liberal. He's more of a classical liberal as opposed to, you know, modern liberalism, if you will. But modern liberalism doesn't really mean anything today, because you have, what was it on Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street, which was a very leftist movement that was very anti-establishment. And then 2020 comes along and the left is like, all right, big pharma, big government, you just control us.
Right.
So it's this weird kind of, it's this vacuous space that they're in, that they don't have a grounding principle or way of looking at things. They're not looking to look at things objectively. They're looking to validate their conclusion. And so they start with a premise, and on our side as well, let's say at Badlands, they start with the premise. A lot of people start with the premise that there is all of these, let's say, unknown events and things that are happening that are either deep state or you know, we have white hackers that are fighting back against, and Trump's is still in control, and the military is in control. And when you start with that kind of premise, you're looking for things to validate it, and exactly. We have a hard time admitting we're wrong. On a note that you mentioned, Justin Trudeau, who it's just, you know, it's always entertaining to talk about that clown. He is the epitome of somebody who has no humility, is completely arrogant. He's incompetent too, which is dangerous, right? When you have incompetence and arrogance, they really become something that can destroy things, and without knowing, with otherwise what he thinks are good intentions, but he's really making people suffer in Canada unnecessarily. But he's the epitome of somebody, and I think he has a arrested development to a certain extent. And there's seriously, I think he's a man child. Like, he's just totally having tantrums, and he's right and can't admit. There's not once where he acknowledged that he was even slightly wrong in the last 8 years. Right? That's a problem. In politics, in life, that's a problem. So, you know, hearing what you're kind of ethos is, which is not something definitive. It's something that is just like, to a certain extent, it is definitive, but it's very foundational. Is that right? It's very like you from what I've seen, you cover an array of topics. You guys have covered pretty much everything from politics to health, right?
Yeah. Wars and everything,
in between.
censorship,
Right.
stuff like that.
Freedom in general.
I always like, my creed is that I don't really know anything necessarily, but I'm just good at looking at things from different perspectives. You know?
Yeah, that's good.
There's some things that we think we know, things that are more likely true than not, or we believe are more likely true than not. Simon's having a struggle today.
Right. Yeah.
But like the Descartesian or the Cartesian, I heard that they refer to it as Cartesian, but that's kind of isn't Cartesian have to do with maps?
Math,
like a cartographer,
like Cartesian geometry.
Yeah, but then Descartes was a mathematician, actually, I believe.
Right. Yeah.
Anyways, but so his thinking, there's things that we are pretty much sure are true, but then there's semantics that comes into play as well, because things that we know are true, I have two hands. Well, what's a hand? Then you start getting into how we define things, right? So,
right.
Going down to the foundation is important, and I think it's important that we do that with everything, right? On our side too, right? Or I keep saying our side. I don't mean, I just mean in the free thinking side. Right. I don't mean right or left. I don't mean Republican, Democrat. It's people that want to think and have critical thinking capacities and want to get to the truth.
Well, it's almost like we're not allowed to do that. Like, we just have to accept, like, trans women are women, and
nothing in between.
Nothing in between, and there's no room for debate. And then, contrarily, on the right, you have like the same kind of mentality, like, Israel is in the right no matter what they do, kind of things like that. You know what I mean? Like, there's no room for debate on certain topics. Yeah,
no nuance. Yeah, and so the abortion one is a complicated one, but so it's a complicated one because look, they're on both sides. There's no nuance. It's moment of conception and until the baby's out of the stomach, and there's an array of opinions in the middle, right? And okay, respect. You have to respect both ideas to a certain extent, but at some point you have to decide. All right, what is murder, or what is a living organism? And that's that discussion. Because at the moment of conception, you're telling me when the sperm and the egg meet, that's life. Maybe. To remove that, is that murder? Maybe. But so that's where the discussion comes in, and there's nuance there on our side, on the right as well. There needs to be some kind of, and there's also the idea on the right, which is we don't want the government involved. We want the government as small as possible. So if these people in this state vote to do something, that's their right to do it. You can preach against it, but there's a conundrum there on the right. It's like we have these things that are absolutely sure about, but then it conflicts with our idea of freedom and small government.
Yeah, that's one of those things that they always put front and center, because it's one of those things that will never have a universally accepted answer. And that way it perpetuates the divide endlessly. And that's why it's like all of the major like media outlets on either side really put that in the forefront. The same thing with the trans thing. Like, obviously there's a lot of social contagion happening, but there's also like people who are actually like, mentally unwell and have to deal with that. And maybe showing a little compassion to those people could go a long way. I don't know. But it's like we have to take these hard stances either way, and they just, there's no room for communicating or talking about it on either side, because that's when things actually you can negotiate. And I think that's what Donald Trump was trying to do, is at least give the people who were against abortion like a seat at the table to kind of negotiate, because they didn't really have that prior to Roe v. Wade being reversed. So
all these issues are social wedge issues, and that's kind of the whole point, is that underneath all these layers of politics, in my opinion, you have a group of people who are some of the most sophisticated con men on earth, the same people who brought us our medical system, the same people who created the Federal Reserve, the same people who created mass media as we know it, and the music industry. And they're all almost exactly the same people in the sense that they come from the same sector of society. We intermarry with each other. You know, whether we want to call them a cabal or, you know, I'm not giving you any labels necessarily to work with, but just acknowledging the facts that we can verify. We have all these interesting globalists, we'll say, at all these different layers of our society, pulling the strings, using the media to frame certain issues. And because we're social creatures, one of the things we use to signal to somebody that they're in our tribe or vice versa is through our opinions. And so the more they can control the opinion polls, the more that they can control the people in between, either by silencing them, because if you have a nuanced issue on abortion or Israel or the trans issue or whatever the issue that is polarized happens to be, you don't identify with anyone. You're in a no man's land. And so if you haven't taken the time to understand arguably one of the strongest influences on your brain and your being and your mind possible, which is your social instincts and your socialization psychology, then you're going to be pulled from side to side and not have any idea, all while thinking it's your opinion and your thought. And they're very good at doing that. So that's why, you know, to bring it back to critical thinking, like I said in the beginning, it's not a magic formula you can execute and you're going to get a definitive correct answer, and then you don't have to stop thinking anymore. It's actually not that way at all. As a matter of fact, literally everything that I've ever taken the time to critical think about, and other people I know, they don't have absolute opinions out of them. They have opinions that are constantly, you know, being assessed and reassessed and thought of. And so that doesn't mean that you don't have any beliefs, because that's the other side. So I wanted to mention that, like, when you critically think, it doesn't mean you believe nothing because you can't prove anything to be true. What it means is that you have to decide, you have to make what I call operational conclusions. For example, if you're in a restaurant and the cook comes running out screaming, the food's poison, you don't have the time to go and get a chemical sample to see what poison's in there, to evaluate the character of the chef to see if he's all cracked out or if he's actually coming from the truth, to evaluate the business. You know, you don't have time to do a sophisticated investigation. Life is about making the best decision you possibly can in any kind of situation you're in, but it's when you shackle yourself to that decision, for whatever reason, either because you want to be included in a social group or because you've, you know, as we were talking about, you're invested in your opinion now because you decided on a complex issue too early. You posted on social media, you got a bunch of dopamine, serotonin hits because a whole bunch of people liked it, all that kind of stuff. It's all influencing us. But with our will, our free will, the same thing the founding fathers were so, you know, invested in trying to get people to use. You can actually change your beliefs, you can change your position, you can actually course correct in life and go towards a place of not only truth, but a place of goodness and prosperity for yourself, your family, and your community.
Yeah, people today are very the idea of self-governance and self-responsibility has just been weeded out of us for such a long time, where people don't have this feeling that they are actually responsible for their own actions, even, which is insane.
Right.
To piggyback on the idea that they have this divide and they try to control the polls, they are much happier with us arguing about trans issues, abortion issues, you know, women's rights issues, gay rights, whatever. This is all superficial stuff. They don't want us talking about wars. They don't want us talking about the military industrial complex. They don't want us talking about the Fed, about currency, about the medical corruption, about all this corruption. They want us arguing about abortion and all this stuff, which is, you know, they are topics to be argued, but for that to be the front and center argument when you have $1.8 trillion bills being passed every year, which is absurd. Right. Somehow we've gotten to Dr. Evil's $1 billion gazillion dollars, you know, in no time. You know, $1 billion 20 years ago was a ton of money. Right now we're talking about trillions. They just realize that they can, you know, it's on its last leg, and they're just like, just print it out as fast as we can, which is absurd. It's insane. Also, to go back to the idea of certainty and the idea of starting from a conclusion, that is what happens in science today. Mm-hmm. Climate change. They start with the conclusion and work backwards. But because it's statistics, they can manipulate the statistics.
Exactly. That's how studies are conducted now. They decide on the conclusion and then they tweak the control to create that conclusion. Just like with aspartame. There was a study done that they still cited today as like proof that aspartame is harmless, where they determined that, independently, that after so many months, a mouse will develop cancer if it is fed aspartame. So when they go to do the study, they only do it for 3 months instead of 4 months, which is the month where it starts to develop. So now they tailor the study to produce a specific outcome retroactively. And that's just how it is.
It's how it is in every scientific field, which is crazy, because that science was the place where we had the most grounding, let's say, in the last century, where it was actually done properly and there was a good system of, let's say, peer review system right now is a joke.
Yeah.
In on pretty much every field. It's an echo chamber in the scientific world. And they literally are reviewing each other's work with the same premise, with the same conclusions. And they're like, oh yeah, of course this is right. Of course this is right. And clearly they're going to reject papers that don't align with their ideologies. So much of science today and these studies, if somebody used to say, oh, it's a peer-reviewed study, it meant it was a highly reliable source. Today, I hear peer review and I'm like, it means absolutely nothing. You have to actually look at the data and look at the experiment, and look at the report of what was happening and how these experiments took place. Virus experimentation and studies that were done in the 50s, I believe, was when the first ones were done. I need to brush up on my contagion myth information, but when you look at the way that this experiment was run, and they use obviously like lingo that is more complicated than the layman would understand, but for no reason. It's like legal jargon. They make it complicated. They muddy the waters to make them seem deep. That's one of my favorite quotes, actually.
That's a great one.
It's true.
But
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, just to finish that, this virus study, when you break it down and you actually translate these lingo words that we otherwise don't know, it's like they literally manipulated the whole thing to give the illusion that this thing that they saw, it's like looking at let's say a plate and there's a bunch of crumbs on it, and they're like, oh, that thing there, that is a virus. But you can't actually extract it. They never extract it. They never take the virus and put it into something else. They never replicate it, and so that's a whole different story. I know that not everybody is on my same page with that, but it just goes to show that this has been going on for a long time. You were about to say something, Ryan, and I kept rambling.
I just wanted to say that it's not to say that everybody who is trying to practice science nowadays is like totally corrupt. Right. It's just that scientists are paid to be scientists, and that money has to come from somewhere. So there's tons of people out there who are doing great studies, but those studies don't get elevated to, a place where they're at the top of Google. And what does get elevated is stuff that like helps a specific industry, So you might be a good scientist, but the people who are paying you to conduct the study are paying you for a specific reason and a specific result.
Yep.
But, I just wanted to add that caveat.
Yeah. 100%.
Absolutely. The funding of these, when Bill Gates is funding this research, and he's also the main investor in Moderna, and he's, bringing shots to Africa and testing on, there's conflicts of interest here. You're paying scientists and you're not going to pay them if they don't come up with the result you need, because you're going to make money over here. We've gotten to a very dark place in terms of politics and the structure of our civilization and society. And we spoke about this a little bit in Tulsa about, my two things are the 17th Amendment, which is the Senate being popularly elected, and the idea that the House of Representatives was limited to 435 members of the House because of literally the number of seats in the Capitol building. Just to quickly go back to the intent of people, we had Kristen Nagel on. I don't know if you know Kristen Nagel. She's a Canadian nurse. We had a conversation with her recently on the Liberty North show. Go check out the Liberty North show. Me and Simon, who keeps popping in and out. But so when we went through this modern, the development of the modern medical system and the Rockefellers and whatnot, that there was intent there to push petrochemicals and drugs. But today, nurses and doctors go into their fields with the intent of helping people. They're not going in there to try to with the idea of harming people, or with the idea that they're going to get propaganda all the way through and, have basically be drug pushers to a certain extent. They're not going in with that intent. But for the 17th Amendment, I'd like to go back to that briefly, because I'd like to talk about this any chance I get, and I'll get your take on it. When the founding fathers drafted the Constitution, they had one member of the House of Representatives for every 30,000 people. The country was founded with 4 million people. With 4 million people across 13 states on the East Coast, a republic is possible. A republic, not to get into Plato and Aristotle and, let's say, the Enlightenment thinkers, but a republic is something that needs to be on a small scale for it to be able to function properly, because it's representative government and you need to have somebody who represents you. Now, one member of the House of Representatives represents 700,000 people, and they live in Washington, D.C. It used to be some guy that is part of your community. 30,000 people is a small town. You can go to them and they live in your town. And when Congress congregates, they would go to Washington to vote on the way that you as a community believe things should be voted on. That seems to make a lot more sense, right? Like,
Totally.
that actually sounds like there's a lot more responsibility and a lot more accountability when it comes to politicians, because if they come back to their town and they didn't vote the way that the people that voted them in wanted them to, they can easily get rid of them. They can easily impeach. So for that to be possible today, there would have to be like 11,000 members of the House of Representatives.
Right.
Which sounds a bit absurd, but not really. It's not that, especially with the technology we have today, it's not that absurd. And these people in Washington don't need to be aristocrats. They're aristocrats right now. They are people that are, giving themselves raises every year, even though we're in trillions of dollars of debt.
Yeah.
There's a problem there.
Permanent political class, basically.
Exactly.
But there's another way you could do it too, and that is to remove take some of the power from the federal government and bring it back to the states, and put more emphasis on state senate and stuff like that. I think that's kind of where things are going, and
absolutely,
and that seems way more manageable. So if you want to be able to have abortions 10 years after your child's born, and you want to butcher your genitals, this state allows that, and that state should, facilitate those people who live in other states that identify with those kind of laws to come move to their state, but they don't want that. They just want the people divided everywhere, fractured and angry. But I think there's a lot of common sense solutions to a lot of these things. But definitely, yeah. I mean, they spend how much money on the new FBI headquarters? They could add a few more seats to Congress, I think.
Exactly.
Right. And so Bill Federer, who I had on, is like, well, I go to conferences with 10,000 people. 10,000 people show up and we do our business. We communicate, we talk, we have a little, what's it called? Little mini conferences within the conference. And we get our business done. And they could rent out a stadium. They could rent out a basketball stadium and do it there. I mean, why not?
Couple things. So first of all, I've studied law for a very long time. When you go to law school, you don't really study law, you study process. And the reason that's important to know about is that studying real law, not to puff myself up here, but I'm just saying this is the facts of what I've taken the time to understand, is like studying the rules of a game. If you understand how hockey works, if you understand why the rules were designed for a particular purpose, then you can evaluate the quality of those rules. For example, if the rule is not congruent, meaning one team A can take 3 shots in 10 minutes, whereas team B can take 2 shots in 2 minutes, clearly it's disproportionate. There's no congruency, there's no equal opportunity to score, and therefore the principal purpose of a game, which is to measure the quality of the players in the teams to see which one is best, cannot actually be achieved. So in order for a person to evaluate the quality of a game's rules, they have to understand enough about it to actually have a good enough grasp on it. Politics can be thought of as a grand game, the game of living with other people. If you don't have a good rule set for managing all the different things that are going on, if you don't have a good way to form decisions, if you don't present arguments and proposals and have those be evaluated, if you don't understand what a trustee is, which the government is the trustee of the people, then you can't really measure the quality of your government. And that's by design. The reason we're having so many issues is because people don't understand these things. Not to say that we couldn't do them, you know. I don't know much about the rules of hockey, but I bet you if somebody taught me about it, I'd probably be able to have a decent enough opinion to say, hey, you know, this rule is not fair, or this rule is fair. So when it comes to Congress and representative government, you know, the representative government works, but you need all the players in the game to know what the rules are and to actually play fairly in order for the game of politics to actually work properly. And right now, it's like effectively equivalent to, we have a body, right? So Congress is the central nervous system. They funnel up information from the cells, which are the people, and then the tissues, which are like the communities and towns and townships and things like this. And that information in the form of our opinions about what we want to have happen should funnel up through the central nervous system, get to the brain, which is Congress, where decisions can be made and things of this sort. Well,
I really like this analogy. I have to steal that.
Yeah, it's a good one. And so because none of the cells are actually communicating to the central nervous system, there's no information. There's no guidance being transferred to the trustee. A trustee is the person you lend your car to. They say, hey, I need your car to go grab my friend from work. I'll have it back in an hour. Well, that means you're going to give them your property in trust, meaning you're going to give them a set of rules. You're going to tell them what your will is, like don't crash my car, make sure you bring it back with the gas properly, you know, tuned. And then you're going to have this definitive way of evaluating whether or not that person you lent the car to actually did what they said they do, like by inspecting it after they hand you the keys when they're done. And if the trustee violates your rules, then you know you can't trust your friend with your car. It's the same exact principle as at work.
Can you take that analogy that you just did and actually give real life example with the government? Because I feel like that would be very
100%.
Yeah.
So let's get right down to the bottom. Like, well, where do our abilities to have government come from at all? They come from God. We have rights, and God gave us these rights, meaning we have this ability to determine what we think is fair. Universal rights are this idea that, well, everybody in a town should have the right to food, should have the right to water, should have the right to autonomy, free association, which basically means that you have the right to say yes or no when you're being offered something, which is another way of calling freedom versus slavery. And so a trustee, because we all, to point to what you were saying before, we can't sit around in 10 minutes and decide complex issues like whether or not we should build an FBI building as a 333 million population country. We appoint trustees to take our will as people and be like, well, listen, I would like this to happen as a citizen. And so that has to funnel up through the central nervous system of the government, you know, so it has to go from the individual citizen to their town. Their representatives talk to the representative of the county, which then goes to the state house, which then goes to, so I mean, I'm kind of being fast and loose with the way the divisions work,
Sure.
But the design I just mentioned is exactly how the founding fathers were envisioning the country. So when that happens properly, my representative, I live in Georgia, I have a certain number of representatives that specifically deal with my area. I don't know who they are. You know, shame on me for not knowing that. I probably should, but let's say it's Marjorie Taylor Greene. Well, if I go to Marjorie Taylor Greene and I'm like, hey, Marjorie, I do not want an FBI building funded, and here are the reasons why. I think it takes away from our freedoms. I think it's funding, you know, blah, 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 blah. I give a good, compelling reason. Then her job as a trustee is to simply take my will and execute that in Congress.
Exactly.
She's not there to put her own opinion in. She's not there to tell me my reason is bogus. You know, she's just there to represent me. Now, obviously, there's more nuance to the situation describing a quick example, but for the same reason you would not want to lend your car to somebody who did not bring it back in one piece, who did not fill it after you told them to, or went and got, you know, picked up a prostitute while they said they were actually going to drop their friend off at work, is the same basic reason we have a government absolutely filled with people who violate the trust of the people. Yeah, prostitutes.
This is what you're saying. Pretty much.
So yeah, so I mean, you know, it's the answer is a little complex in the sense that.
And so there was just a couple layers where there were things that are violated. Sorry, can you just So a couple layers where things are
trust is
violated.
The trust is
Yeah.
violated. We have rights. We give our rights to the representative. They're supposed to represent us in government. And our will has to make sense. That's the thing the founding fathers put on the cap of this. We're not a democracy in the sense that if a bunch of people decide we're going to murder 8-year-old boys, we're going to just go ahead and do it. Our will has to honor the fundamental laws of what we think are governing reality, which is the laws that everybody has rights. We have a right to life. We have the right to freedom. So these are the things that are enshrouded in the Bill of Rights and things like this. So
And they
when our
also
rights
actually are entrusted with our property to a certain extent. Right.
100%. Well, property, and according to definitions of law, property is the right of use. So property is itself a form of rights. So it all boils down to rights. And when people don't honor your rights, when your trustee doesn't honor your rights, when they don't even ask you what you want, or when they do, this is what actually happens. They run on a set of issues. We're going to stop abortion. We're going to get that bridge built. We're going to do X, Y, Z. Then they get into Congress, and all of a sudden it's like, what happened? You didn't do anything that you said you would. Well, it's exactly the same thing as if you lent your friend a car and he did something opposite to what he said he was going to do. What we should be doing as a people is firing these politicians. We have recall, despite whatever the state laws are in your country, in your county. And your recall is a fundamental right of reality that every single person has. But it takes enforcement. We actually have to band together. We need to stop arguing about stupid issues that do nothing but cause division. We have to focus on the important issues like your rights are being violated. I don't necessarily want to have a transgender agenda, but frankly, it's more important that we get our rights protected as a citizenry than this particular issue. We'll worry about that after the house isn't being burnt down. But right now, let's put the fire out in the house and actually go try to do something that protects all our rights, and then we can get together. So there you go. There's my rant for the day.
Thank you. And we can continue that. We should have more conversations because there's so many points that we can talk about. But for now, I know you guys are on a tight schedule. Let's wrap it up, guys. Pleasure having you here. Vigilant News. If you've been watching this far, Vigilant News, you guys are mostly on Rumble, right?
Yeah.
Rumble, yeah. Telegram. You have a great Telegram channel that I follow and I get my news from. And so how do people find your Telegram? How would people find your Telegram if they wanted to? Just Vigilant
search
News?
For Vigilant News. You can go to vigilant.news, the website. That's our website where we post our shows, our show notes. We have 3 shows. We got interview shows we're doing. We got the news show on Monday, 3 p.m. And we have a show called Vigils, which is kind of like this one. Do you want to chime in?
Yeah, and then I'm on Substack. I run a Substack called The Post Liberal. So check that out if you feel so inclined. And also, I got a movie that's coming out this Saturday called Time of Deceit that I wish there was more clarity around when exactly it's going to be available for the public.
It's going to be on Badlands?
Yeah, we're going to... It's being shown, was premiering at a closed event this Saturday. And then there's an event in Venice, Florida, where it's being shown to the public, but I think the tickets are already sold out for that. But soon it's going to be available for free on Rumble. So look for Time of Deceit here in the coming weeks.
I also love the post-liberal. I think it reflects the name. It reflects a lot of people that, like us.
Yeah. Right? Who don't really have they're not quite ready to go all in on the cult of the right. But they're
not
no
anarchists.
Longer. Yeah, exactly. So
which I'm leaning more and more towards, by the way. That's another discussion.
Yeah,
Michael Malice is an anarchy. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Guys,
it was a great time. I'm really glad we came on, and I'd love to have endless chats later. So let's do it.
Let's do it. All right, guys. Take care. Take care, folks.